There are very few indie horror franchises that exploded as violently, strangely, and controversially as Garten of Banban, because what started as a tiny project made by two young brothers somehow evolved into one of the biggest examples of modern mascot horror culture and internet algorithm abuse all at once. And if you were anywhere near YouTube in early 2023, then you probably remember the exact moment this thing started taking over the internet, because suddenly clips of the game were absolutely everywhere. Reaction channels were farming millions of views from it. Theory videos were being uploaded daily. Children's content farms started mass-producing animations with the characters. TikTok edits flooded social media. Bootleg mobile games appeared overnight, and the entire internet became obsessed with trying to understand whether this game was intentionally awful or some kind of accidental masterpiece. Because at first glance, Garten of Banban genuinely looked like a parody of mascot horror itself, featuring these bizarre, colorful mascots with lifeless expressions, strange, empty environments that looked unfinished, awkward chase scenes, stiff animations, simplistic gameplay mechanics, weird dialogue, and deep lore notes that felt like they were trying incredibly hard to sound mysterious. And because of all this, many people initially assumed the game had to be satire. But the more people looked into it, the more fascinating the entire situation became, because it slowly became clear that the developers were completely serious. And that realization caused a massive online debate surrounding not just the game itself, but the entire state of mascot horror as a genre. Because to understand why Garten of Banban became such a phenomenon, you first need to understand the people behind it, the Euphoric brothers. Two brothers named Ferris and Geppo from Canada, who before all the memes and controversy were simply young indie developers, desperately trying to make games people would notice, releasing small experimental horror projects like Swallow the Blue, Introvert, A Teenager Simulator, and several other surreal horror games heavily inspired by internet creepypasta culture, cryptic storytelling, and strange psychological themes. And even back then, their games already showed the same strengths and weaknesses that would later define Banban. Because while the stories and atmosphere often had genuinely creative ideas behind them, the gameplay itself usually felt simplistic, repetitive, awkward, and underdeveloped, with many of their earlier games featuring things like unskippable dialogue, random trial-and-error sequences, strange puzzle mechanics, intentionally crashing rooms inspired by haunted game creepypastas, and environments that existed more to tell weird stories than to provide engaging gameplay. And while these games never became popular, it was obvious the brothers genuinely loved horror storytelling and wanted to build something bigger. But one of the biggest recurring problems was how quickly they released everything, because instead of spending years polishing one game, they were rapidly pushing out multiple projects within incredibly short periods of time, reusing systems, templates, and design philosophies repeatedly. And while reusing frameworks isn't inherently bad, it created the impression that the brothers prioritized quantity and speed over refinement and technical growth, and then mascot horror entered the picture, which completely changed everything because by the early 2020s, mascot horror had stopped being just another horror subgenre and evolved into a fully optimized internet content machine fueled by YouTube algorithms, reaction culture, children's content, merchandise, theory videos, and marketable mascots, with games like Five Nights at Freddy's and Poppy Playtime, proving that horror games no longer needed revolutionary gameplay to dominate online culture, as long as they had recognizable characters, hidden lore, reaction bait, and moments creators could endlessly recycle into content. And once the Euphoric brothers experimented with their own mascot horror concepts through smaller projects like Gumpy, where YouTubers surprisingly began noticing their work despite the game itself being rough and simplistic, they seemingly realized something extremely important about modern internet culture, which was that attention mattered more than polish, and that realization ultimately led to the release of Garten of Banban on January 6, 2023, a game that instantly confused almost everybody because the actual experience itself was incredibly small, lasting roughly 10 to 15 minutes for most players, and mostly consisting of basic fetch quests, simplistic button puzzles, scattered lore notes, and a drone mechanic that many people criticized for being painfully uncreative compared to mechanics from other mascot horror games. Because unlike the grab pack from Poppy Playtime, which introduced creative movement and puzzle opportunities, the Banban drone essentially boiled down to slowly floating toward buttons and pressing them, forcing players to constantly wait around while doing extremely simple tasks. But despite how mechanically weak the game was, it somehow became unforgettable due to the accidental comedy created by its presentation. Especially characters like Opala Bird, whose awkward blank stare instantly became meme material online, with the bird feeding sequence and clunky chase scenes spreading everywhere because people genuinely could not decide whether they were supposed to laugh or feel scared. And ironically, that confusion became one of the game's greatest strengths, because whether audiences loved the game ironically or sincerely no longer mattered once the algorithm grabbed hold of it, leading to the full activation of the mascot horror machine as reaction videos exploded. Content farms flooded YouTube Kids with bizarre animations using the characters, theory channels started overanalyzing the lore, and bootleg toys and mobile ripoffs appeared almost immediately, all while criticism toward the franchise intensified because many people began viewing it as proof that the barrier to success within indie horror had become dangerously low, arguing that the series represented algorithm bait more than genuine craftsmanship, especially after people noticed how aggressively the franchise already seemed prepared for monetization through merchandise stores, future chapter wish lists, branding, and rapid expansion plans, despite the first game itself barely lasting longer than a YouTube video, creating the perception that the developers were speedrunning franchise creation rather than naturally building a quality horror experience. And then Garten of Banban 2 released, and everything somehow became even more controversial, because instead of slowing down to improve the formula, the developers doubled down on rapid-fire releases, resulting in more repetitive gameplay, obvious padding, simplistic fetch quests, backtracking, rough optimization, and infamous sequences like the classroom section where players were forced through repetitive quiz mechanics and unskippable dialogue. And this is where accusations of anti-refund design really exploded, because many players realized the games consistently hovered near Steam's 2-hour refund limit while simultaneously padding gameplay through repetitive tasks, long hallways, slow movement systems, repeated button pressing, and forced backtracking, causing some YouTubers and streamers to publicly refund the games after finishing them as a form of protest, which triggered another major controversy when the developers emotionally responded online by criticizing content creators for refunding the games while profiting from videos about them, leading to massive debates across the internet about whether refunding a short game after fully completing it was immoral or simply a consumer right, especially when the games themselves felt intentionally stretched to maximize playtime. And at the same time, technical criticism toward the franchise exploded after artists and developers began closely analyzing the actual game files and discovered absurdly high polygon counts on extremely simple models, badly optimized geometry, poor UV mapping, and inefficient asset construction, with some models reportedly containing polygon counts comparable to or even exceeding assets from highly detailed AAA horror games, despite looking dramatically simpler, which became one of the biggest memes surrounding the franchise because people genuinely could not understand why simplistic mascot models had such ridiculous topology. And honestly, this criticism was completely fair, because from a game development perspective, the polygon count issue revealed a lack of optimization knowledge and workflow discipline, with many artists explaining that the models appeared to be created without proper retopology or optimization passes, almost as if sculpted freely and exported directly into the game, causing unnecessary performance strain for visuals that still looked relatively crude. And while some later entries did show improvement in areas like animation quality, voice acting, environmental detail, and storytelling structure, the technical sloppiness remained a recurring criticism throughout the franchise, with many people joking that the series contained quintillions of polygons while still looking low budget. Yet despite all the criticism, backlash, memes, controversy, and technical issues, something genuinely fascinating happened over time because the series slowly became self-aware, gradually embracing its own absurdity while improving certain aspects of its formula, introducing better voice acting, more elaborate scripted scenes, larger environments, stronger lore presentation, and slightly more creative gameplay ideas in later entries like the hub areas, hide-and-seek sequences, rooftop chase scenes, and character-focused story moments. And although the games still suffered heavily from padding, awkward pacing, repetitive mechanics, and questionable design decisions, the franchise slowly transformed into what many people began calling a so-bad-it's-good ironic classic where audiences no longer necessarily expected greatness, but instead tuned in because they genuinely wanted to see whatever bizarre, unpredictable thing the series would do next. And honestly, that may be the most fascinating thing about Garten of Banban as a whole, because love it or hate it, the franchise accidentally exposed the true nature of modern internet horror culture better than almost any other game by proving that in the age of algorithms, YouTube reactions, theory channels, content farms, TikTok clips, and meme-driven popularity, a horror game no longer needs to be technically impressive or mechanically revolutionary to dominate online culture. It simply needs to be memorable enough that people cannot stop talking about it. One of the most interesting parts about Garten of Banban is that despite all the memes, backlash, criticism, and technical problems, the series genuinely started improving over time in ways a lot of people didn't expect. Because if you compare the first game to the later entries, you can actually watch the euphoric brothers slowly figuring things out in real time under massive public scrutiny. And honestly, that gradual improvement became one of the biggest reasons people kept paying attention to the franchise, even if they hated it. Because every new release felt like this strange mix of genuine progress and completely baffling design choices smashed together into one chaotic package, with the first game basically functioning as a tiny proof of concept where you wandered through empty kindergarten hallways solving simplistic drone puzzles while feeding eggs to Opala Bird and uncovering cryptic lore notes. And while mechanically it barely felt like a full game at all, you could still see small hints of ideas the developers clearly wanted to expand on later, especially with the atmosphere and mascot behavior, because according to the developers, Opala Bird was originally intended to behave more like a predator stalking the player instead of just running at them like a typical horror enemy, which honestly is a genuinely cool concept, even if the execution never fully reached its potential. And then, when Garten of Banban 2 released, the developers clearly attempted to make the experience feel larger and more ambitious by introducing bigger maps, more mascot characters, more scripted moments, and more varied puzzle concepts. But this is also where many of the franchise's biggest flaws became impossible to ignore, because the game relied heavily on repetitive padding, excessive backtracking, slow fetch quests, and frustrating unskippable sequences, with infamous sections like the classroom scene forcing players through repeated quiz mechanics and long dialogue sections that had to be replayed every time you failed. And while some people interpreted this as laziness, it honestly felt more like inexperienced developers desperately trying to stretch limited gameplay ideas into a longer runtime, especially because criticism surrounding the Steam refund limit had already started becoming widespread at this point, since many players noticed the games consistently hovered near the 2-hour mark while padding gameplay through repetitive tasks, long hallways, and slow traversal systems. But despite all this, there were still noticeable attempts at improvement because Banban 2 expanded the world building, introduced more mascot personalities, experimented with chase sequences, and attempted to create more cinematic scripted moments, even if many of them still felt rough around the edges. And then came Garten of Banban 3, which is honestly where the series started becoming weirdly self-aware, and where some genuinely creative ideas finally started slipping through the cracks. Because although the game still suffered heavily from padding and repetitive mechanics, it also introduced more layered gameplay systems, stronger story presentation, and more unique puzzle structures, with sections like the Nab-Nab laboratory puzzle showing actual attempts at multi-step gameplay, where players had to mix formulas, stabilize machinery, manage drone interactions, and avoid threats simultaneously. And while none of these mechanics were particularly deep, they at least demonstrated the developers trying to move beyond basic walking and button pressing. And another noticeable improvement in Banban 3 was variety, because although the game still featured frustrating backtracking and repeated sections, it also experimented with more unique gameplay scenarios, like the hide-and-seek sequence involving Jumbo Josh, where players had to manipulate blocks while avoiding detection, creating at least some level of tension and interaction compared to earlier entries. And perhaps most importantly, Banban 3 started leaning into its own bizarre identity rather than trying to imitate other mascot horror games completely seriously. Because by this point, the internet had already transformed the franchise into a meme. And instead of constantly fighting that image, the games slowly started embracing the absurdity, which honestly helped the series tremendously, because moments that previously felt unintentionally awkward suddenly became entertaining in their own weird way. And this trend continued further in Garten of Banban 4 and Garten of Banban 6, where the developers clearly attempted to push the presentation and scale much further by introducing hub areas, larger maps, stronger voice acting, more cinematic story moments, more elaborate scripted sequences, and more varied puzzle ideas. And while the gameplay still often boiled down to simple tasks underneath the surface, there was at least a visible increase in ambition because earlier games mostly consisted of empty hallways and repetitive fetch quests, whereas later entries attempted to create more memorable gameplay scenarios through things like boss fights involving giant mutated mascots, rhythm-style light management puzzles, rooftop chase sequences, platforming sections, memory games, and even moments where players temporarily controlled mascot characters themselves. And although many of these mechanics still remained fairly simplistic, they at least proved the developers were trying to expand their gameplay vocabulary rather than endlessly recycling the exact same formula. And honestly, one of the biggest improvements across the later games was the voice acting, because while the earlier entries relied heavily on atmosphere and vague lore notes, the later games introduced much more character-driven storytelling through surprisingly committed performances that gave mascots like Sheriff Toadster, Bittergiggle, Stinger Flynn, and Sir Dadadu genuine personality. And even many critics admitted the voice acting became one of the strongest aspects of the franchise because the actors fully committed to the bizarre material and elevated scenes that otherwise might have felt completely ridiculous. And another area where the games noticeably improved was environmental design, because while the first entries mostly consisted of empty kindergarten hallways, later games introduced underground cities, abandoned hotels, laboratories, industrial areas, alien-themed settlements, rooftops, and more detailed, interconnected hub spaces that made the world feel significantly larger and more coherent, especially in Garten of Banban 7, where the city environment genuinely felt more handcrafted and immersive due to its smaller but more focused design. And this is also where the developers finally started reducing one of the franchise's biggest problems, which was excessive backtracking, because earlier games constantly forced players through the same areas repeatedly, while later entries began incorporating more unique exits and forward progression systems that made exploration feel less repetitive. Although even then, the series still struggled heavily with pacing and filler content, because despite all the improvements, the developers never fully escaped their tendency to artificially extend gameplay through slow movement, repetitive tasks, excessive button pressing, and drawn-out traversal systems. And unfortunately, the technical side of the franchise remained controversial throughout nearly every release, because while the games visually improved over time, many optimization issues still persisted due to questionable asset construction and the famously absurd polygon counts found on extremely simple models, which honestly became one of the funniest yet most legitimate criticisms surrounding the franchise, because people genuinely could not understand how simplistic mascot characters and tiny environmental props contained geometry counts comparable to highly detailed AAA horror games. And from a development perspective, the criticism was completely fair, because efficient polygon usage is one of the most basic principles of 3D optimization, especially for games intended to run smoothly across different hardware. And the fact that tiny objects sometimes contained ridiculous amounts of geometry strongly suggested rushed workflows and a lack of optimization passes during development, with many artists pointing out that some models appeared to have been exported directly from sculpting stages without proper cleanup or retopology, which likely contributed to the performance problems players frequently experienced despite the games themselves not looking visually demanding. But even with all these flaws, the series still managed to evolve in a genuinely fascinating way, because over time, Garten of Banban stopped feeling like developers desperately chasing trends and slowly transformed into this bizarre, self-aware internet horror saga where both the creators and the audience fully understood how absurd the entire thing had become. And honestly, that self-awareness may have saved the franchise because once the games embraced their own chaotic identity, they became significantly more entertaining to follow, with each new entry feeling less like a failed attempt at serious mascot horror and more like watching two developers continuously throw increasingly ridiculous ideas at the wall while slowly improving their storytelling, presentation, and world-building abilities along the way. And while the franchise still remains deeply flawed in many areas, it's hard to deny that comparing the first game to the later entries reveals a clear trajectory of growth, ambition, experimentation, and gradual improvement. Even if that growth constantly existed alongside the same rushed development habits, technical issues, padding, and bizarre design choices that made the series infamous in the first place. And honestly, whether you love Garten of Banban, hate it, or just find the whole thing entertaining to watch unfold, it's hard to deny that the franchise became one of the most fascinating examples of modern internet horror culture. From bizarre mascot designs and meme-worthy moments to massive backlash, technical criticism, and surprisingly noticeable improvements over time, the series somehow managed to evolve from what many people thought was just another low-effort indie horror game into this strange internet phenomenon that people simply couldn't stop talking about. The games are still deeply flawed in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's genuinely interesting watching the euphoric brothers slowly improve, experiment, and lean further into the chaotic identity that made the franchise so memorable in the first place. Whether the series eventually crashes and burns or somehow continues evolving into something much bigger, one thing is certain. Garten of Banban accidentally exposed exactly how powerful internet algorithms, meme culture, YouTube reactions, and mascot horror have become in modern gaming culture. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe because it genuinely helps the channel out a ton and lets me keep making longer deep dives and videos like this. Feel free to leave your own thoughts, opinions, or criticisms in the comments as well because I'd honestly love to hear what you think about the whole Garten of Banban situation and whether you think the series actually improved over time or not. Also, while you're here, be sure to check out the other videos and shorts on the channel because there's plenty more weird internet rabbit holes, horror content, and gaming deep dives coming soon.